You live in Vienna. You have seen a coach with horses. In Schubert's time, this was the normal form of transportation. And he must have seen this all the time in front of his house. And I really hear the horses here.
These words by Andras Schiff, one of the greatest pianists of our time, convinced my imagination that the left hand illustrates a coach in Schubert's musical moment in F minor. So, with that picture in mind, let's begin designing the accompaniment. All we want from the left hand is to carry this standard music with consistent dynamics and timing. Given its accompanying role and considering Schubert's dynamics, we seek delicate texture. There is a simple way to achieve this naturally. The first step is to keep the wrist and fingers flexible. Then we can move the forearm up and down, left and right, to regulate both the weight and direction of the wrist. So let's keep the hand loose for lightness, then bounce the wrist in and out for each note. Remember, the deeper you go, the more sound you get. To be able to play this kind of texture unfailingly with an organic sound, I recommend focusing more on the wrist control and less on the fingers. Additionally, once you get used to this wrist movement, you can create an even more sophisticated accompaniment by bringing the top voice to the fore when playing offbeats. Now let's talk about the right hand, the melody. We have an 8-bar phrase consisting of 2 subphrases, each 4 bars long. So even though they are melodically different, they complement each other musically and make this phrase a whole. Let's begin with the first 4 bars. Here we have a melody rich with diverse types of articulation. It consists of staccato 8ths, slurred 16ths, and accented quarter notes. I emphasize the staccato and accented notes and play the rest lightly. The first and the third bars motifs are very playful, so their emphasis will be gentler. Still, I pronounce the first beat a bit more than the second to express the time signature better. The second and the fourth bars motifs are more assertive, so let's emphasize them distinctly. This time, I emphasize both beats with equal strength because of the melodic structure and accents. At measure 6, quickly move your hand forwards between the black keys to play more comfortably. I play the grace notes before the beat and also lightly. I even imagine a crescendo towards the main note for a better expression. So, start in a natural position and dive with the wrist toward the accented quarter notes. In my opinion, playing the beats with different intensities, depending on the melody's character, will give this piece a colorful 2/4 feel. There is neither accent nor staccato in the second part of the phrase. Instead, there are mostly slurred notes, and therefore we need to show the contrast in the sound. Let's start with the top line. I will use my wrist to make the slurred notes sound more natural. Considering the direction of the melody in the first 2 motifs, I dive with my wrist, then go right and then up. Again, down, right, up. In the next motif, I will move the wrist down, to the left, and upwards, like a semicircle. In the last 2 motifs, I will move my wrist in the same direction as the first 2, but with relatively small movements. Let's hear the difference. Fixed wrist, motion in the wrist. As you can hear, the fingers produce a more natural tone when the wrist moves elastically. Before we add the second layer, let's plan the phrasing. First, I will develop the melody towards the first beat of the second measure. On the second beat, right after the slight pause, I will soften the dynamics abruptly. So there is some excitement and some surprise involved. In the last 2 measures, on the contrary, I will start the melody with a slight emphasis and then gradually calm it down. This way, we form 2 pairs of bars that musically complete each other. We must keep the bottom layer softer than the melody for transparency and delicacy. With that being said, we must develop its dynamics parallel to the upper line and carefully apply its articulation. Before playing the whole first phrase, here is how I see the situation. As I said earlier, we have two subphrases. Let's call them A and B. A does the action, and B gives the reaction. And that's how they form a bigger phrase. Let's try it. For many students, producing contrasting dynamics when playing with both hands is challenging, so the left hand often overshadows the right. If this is the case for you, here is a suggestion that may help. First, let's see each hand as an individual. Each has its dynamics, timing, and color. The left hand, fingers are pretty relaxed and the wrist has complete control with repetitive movements. Next to that is the right hand. Here we add some weight to the wrist and control it with various motions, in and out of the keys. Here the fingers are less flexible, but very focused. All we want is to project these two characters simultaneously by visually and sensually imagining the different movements of each wrist. Well, let's play the first phrase with both hands. Let's move on to the following phrase. Only single notes are in the first half. I want to respect articulation as we design musical expression. For example, I like playing the non-slurred 16th notes, non-legato, but not the type focusing on separation. I prolong each note as much as possible. Imagine a vocal and singing non-legato. The emphasis I put on each note helps them sound less connected. I also emphasize the first 16th note on the beat. The 16th notes contain a slur in the third bar, so connect them carefully with fingers. Let's also phrase this motif with help from the wrist and emphasize the first note a little, like in the previous bar. The first bar's quarter notes contain accents, therefore we need to pronounce them more. First, however, we must adjust the power ratio, considering that the dynamics are still soft. So at the first bar, I apply some directness with a close range attack and immediately turn the volume down at the second bar. Connecting the last quarter notes in measure 4, I soften the second one significantly with the help of the wrist to shape the phrase. The second part of this phrase consists of more voices and layers. In the first two bars, I will highlight the top notes, start with a slight emphasis on the 16th double notes, and phrase them with a wrist movement. Let's play the 16th double notes with a singing non-legato articulation, like earlier. The third bar is more complex, as it has two layers to express individually. Therefore, we must practice them separately for the best result. Let's emphasize the first beat of the syncope in the upper melody, and then soften it. I start the lower layer softly. Then I begin the slurred motif with a crescendo and calm the following 16th notes with a decrescendo. The aim is to enrich the interpretation by phrasing these two layers differently and creating a contrast. Nothing new on the left hand. I'll still look for a consistent texture with the help of the wrist and keep it soft to let the right hand's melody shine through. Let's put them together. Then comes the third phrase. Here Schubert wants forte for the first time. Therefore, let's play the accented chords with a more direct attack, but still with some flexibility in the wrist to avoid producing an aggressive tone. Although I'll emphasize the upper voice to prioritize the melody, I want to show you two different voicing options. In the first one, there is less of a contrast in power between the top voice and the other tones. Of course, the upper layer will be more pronounced in the second and fourth measures. and the double notes in the lower layer will be softer. Although there are no accents, I will sharpen the beats a little to create a more march-like atmosphere. The second option. Here, the top voices are more differentiated from the other notes. I'm playing it brightly again, but the rest are significantly faded. I also increase the flexibility of my wrist. Instead of bouncing as in the previous option, I pause and feel the bottom of the keys, creating a more melodic, but at the same time, quite a tragic ambience. Here, unlike the march character I showed before, I sharpen the first beat and lower the dynamics quite a bit to make it sound painful. I prefer the second option, because it is more compatible with the story I want to tell. You can try both and play however you like. The second part of the phrase begins with the piano dynamic, like an abrupt reaction to the first part. As before, I will emphasize the articulation differences and keep the top notes more present. The sixths on the second beats in measures 24 and 25 are challenging to connect seamlessly with just the fingers. But if we polish the connection of the top notes, we can create an illusion and make them sound legato and smooth. Let's also consider the crescendo and decrescendo while expressing the melody. I still retain the left hand's earlier character, and even in the forte part of the phrase, I prefer not to make it too heavy. Instead, do it with the right hand. Let's hear it with both hands. The following phrase is almost the same as the first one. The three minor differences are that the new phrase does not contain as many accents. It is in the pianissimo dynamic, and we must play the 16th notes in bar 33 with a single slur. And then we have a 10-measure section that brings us to the coda. In the top layer of the first four measures, there is a combination of non-slurred, slurred, and staccato notes. When playing the motifs with slurred notes, please use the same wrist movements as in bar 7 and 31. The most significant challenge here is to be precise with articulation and voicing, because the overall dynamic is still pianissimo. Now let's play the first four bars with the right hand with a clear voicing of both layers. We arrive at the most challenging section, because the overall dynamic is pianissimo. It will keep getting even softer. Let's play the upper melody of the next 6 bars by taking into account every dynamic detail. Bars 41 and 42 consist of contrasting articulations. So while keeping the bottom layer softer, let's also pay attention to that. Playing with both hands gets harder, because in this dynamic, keeping the left hand gentler will be a challenge for any pianist. So the softer we go, the more let's try to reduce the movements of wrists and fingers. The coda is familiar because it contains no textures or motifs we haven't seen before. It is also the softest part of the piece. Please practice each layer patiently as we did before. Bring out the accented notes in the lower layer of the right hand and resolve these voices in the following notes with an imaginary decrescendo. Picture in your mind the horse-drawn carriage slowly moving away. In this piece, I want to keep the dryness in sound and manipulate the tone primarily with my fingers. However, I implement the sustain pedal minimally, like a fragrance, in certain parts of the piece to create more resonance. For example, I use it halfway on every beat in the second half of the first phrase in both appearances, and the first half of the third phrase. The aim is to intensify the contrast between the subphrases in both sections and richen the expression. The role of the left pedal is critical, as Schubert challenges us to play pianissimo in bar 39, and even softer after that. Although the una corda pedal is a tool I use in most situations for color changes, we depend on it for quiet playing here. Therefore, I recommend relying on our fingers as much as possible for dynamics, and using the left pedal only after bar 39. This way, we have a wild card to play even softer than pianissimo. Now we come to my favorite part, timing. Theoretically, we want to keep the tempo persistent. However, when it becomes more comfortable to play this piece, you can spice things up with slight nuances in the timing. When I play the first phrase a second time, I like to stretch the 8th bar. Like when you revisit a place, you don't necessarily want the same experience, but prefer to rediscover it. I do the same in bar 17 when repeating the second phrase. When repeating the third phrase, I stretch the tempo in bars 23 to 24, simultaneously with the crescendo and decrescendo. Bar 33 is the end of the main storyline for me, and by stretching the timing for 2 bars, we can simulate a closure and transform the music to its next step. I stretch the tempo most extensively from bar 39 to 40. I find it tasteful to slow down with the crescendo and decrescendo at one of the most delicate points of the piece. I do the last tempo stretch at bar 43 to transition to the coda, which makes me feel like the coach is passing by a park where the kids are playing. You can slow down in the last bars of the piece to give the ending feeling, but I prefer to avoid it because the imaginary carriage I mentioned at the beginning of the video is slowly moving away. It is not slowing down, it is constant. So I'll keep the tempo steady until measure 54. Then take a breath and play the last chord. As for the tempo, Schubert's choice is allegro moderato. As with most concepts in music, it's abstract terminology. So you must decide what moderately lively tempo means and choose the best pace depending on how you feel about this music. I prefer a slower tempo because it helps me build the piece with more details and give me a broader space to pay attention to each note. I also minimally stretch out all the 16th note motifs, which is probably not noticeable to most listeners. Still, it makes all the difference as it helps to calmly express the more challenging passages. You have seen everything I wanted to explain in this video. The sheet music with my fingerings in the description below, and it's free. Now I will play the whole piece. Here it comes. If you liked the video, please support the channel with a like. Till the next one.